Welcome to our deep dive into the psychology of money. We're going to be looking at Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. And it's not just about understanding, the numbers and crunching numbers. It's about how you behave and your personal history and how all that impacts your relationship with money.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this book. Housel really argues that when it comes to finances, it's really your personal experiences.
Yeah.
And the way you think about money, it can be just as important as, any fancy financial strategy.
Yeah, he really kind of hits you over the head with that right at the beginning of the book when he talks about Ronald Reed, a janitor who quietly amassed an $8 million portfolio. And Richard Fuscone, a Harvard MBA and millionaire who surprisingly declared bankruptcy. So, what is it?
Right.
What is it about these two individuals that put them on such different financial trajectories?
Well, it really challenges the common notion that financial success is a purely intellectual pursuit.
Right.
Reed's story shows the power of patience discipline. And taking that long-term approach to investing, it's not about making a quick buck. It's about steady growth over time.
And Fuscone's story, well, we don't get all the details of the book, really kind of suggests that even with all the right credentials and early success, things can unravel without that behavioral control, without that ability to manage your impulses and stick to a plan. It's like the stories we hear about lottery winners who end up broke a few years later. It's almost as if having money and knowing how to manage it are two completely different skills.
I think that's a great analogy. And House kind of dives deeper into this idea by exploring how our personal histories shape our financial outlook. So think about the events you've lived through. Things like recessions, periods of high inflation, or even those booming economic times. These experiences become ingrained in our minds, almost like a financial fingerprint. That influences our tolerance for risk and the way we approach investing.
He even mentions this study by economists Ulrich Mamandier and Stefan Nagel that found people's risk tolerance is actually influenced more by how the stock market performed during their young adult years than by their level of education or how sophisticated they are financially. Like if you came of age during the dot-com boom of the late 90s, you might be more likely to see stocks as a sure thing compared to someone who lived through the 2008 financial crisis. It almost makes you wonder if our early experiences with money create sort of a financial lens through which we view the world, for better or for worse.
It's certainly a thought-provoking idea, and it ties into another interesting point that Housel makes about how personal circumstances and aspirations can influence our financial choices, even when they seem irrational on the surface. So take the example of lottery tickets. Why would someone struggling financially spend their hard-earned money on something with such slim odds of winning?
Right. You would think they'd be more focused on covering basic necessities.
From a purely rational perspective, yes. But as Housel points out, for someone facing financial hardship, that lottery ticket might represent a tangible dream, a glimmer of hope for a better life. It's a way to escape, even if just temporarily, from their current reality.
So they're not really buying a ticket, they're buying a dream.
Exactly. And it speaks to the powerful role that emotions play in our financial decisions, even when those emotions might not be aligned with logic or probability. It's a reminder that we're not always rational actors. When it comes to money.
And this ties into his discussion of this concept of enough, right? And he uses some pretty compelling examples, like Rajat Gupta, the former Goldman Sachs director, who was convicted of insider trading. And of course, the infamous Bernie Madoff. These are individuals who, by any measure, had achieved immense wealth, but were still driven by this insatiable desire for more. What is it about human nature that it makes us constantly strive for more, even when we seemingly have enough?
That's the paradox of wealth, isn't it? We often seek it out, believing it will bring us admiration and fulfillment. But the reality is what often happens is that others simply see our wealth as a benchmark for their own desires. It becomes this never-ending cycle of wanting more, a constant chase for the next rung on the ladder, with no real sense of satisfaction or contentment.
Keeping up with the Joneses, but on a much grander scale. And that leads us to this fascinating concept. He introduces that wealth is what you don't see, which really challenges the conventional notion of wealth as being about flashy cars and extravagant spending. He argues that true wealth is about building assets that give you options, and perhaps more importantly, control over your time.
That's a really important distinction. It's about having the financial freedom to walk away from a job you hate, to pursue a passion project, or simply to spend more time with loved ones, all without constantly worrying about the next paycheck. It's a more subtle, less visible form of wealth.
He shares some really striking anecdotes about people driving expensive cars, but living paycheck to paycheck. It's a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving when it comes to wealth. Would you say that true wealth is more about building a foundation that gives you security and flexibility, rather than chasing fleeting moments of material gratification?
Absolutely. It's about making choices that align with your long-term goals and values, rather than succumbing to the pressure to keep up with societal expectations or the latest trends. It's about building a life that is both financially sound and personally fulfilling.
It's like choosing to invest in a solid, well-built house. That will provide shelter and comfort for years to come, instead of spending all your money on fancy decorations. That might impress others, but offer little lasting value.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of investments, this brings us to one of the most powerful concepts in personal finance, the magic of compounding.
Ah, yes, the snowball effect. He does such a great job of illustrating this concept, using some really interesting comparisons.
Yeah, he compares it to the formation of ice ages. You know how seemingly insignificant changes in temperature over long periods can have a massive cumulative impact, eventually leading to these vast sheets of ice covering entire continents.
And he also talks about the exponential increase in hard drive storage capacity. Over the past few decades, who would have thought that those clunky hard drives we used to have could evolve into these tiny devices that can hold unimaginable amounts of data? It's a great way to visualize how consistent even small contributions over time can yield remarkable results, especially when you factor in the element of time. It's a powerful argument for starting early, whether we're talking about saving for retirement or investing in our own personal growth.
Absolutely. The earlier you start, the more time you have for that compounding magic to work its wonders. It's not about trying to get rich quick. It's about playing the long game. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Housel draws a distinction between getting wealthy and staying wealthy.
Oh, I remember this part. He contrasts the story of Jesse Livermore, this legendary stock trader who made an absolute fortune during the 1929 market crash, only to later lose it all, with the story of George Moritz, the co-founder of Intel, known for his frugal lifestyle and long-term vision. It really highlights the strategies for building wealth and preserving it are not always the same.
It's an important point. Livermore, despite his incredible talent and market savvy, ultimately fell victim to overconfidence and a series of risky bets. Yeah, it's like he got caught up in the thrill of the win and lost sight of the bigger picture. And then there's Moritz, who took a much more cautious and disciplined approach, prioritizing long-term stability over flashy short-term gains.
Almost like you need a healthy dose of paranoia to stay ahead of the curves, always anticipating potential threats and adapting your strategies accordingly. And this leads perfectly into another concept that Housel explores, the idea of tail events, those rare, unpredictable events that can have an outsized impact on our lives. And the economy.
Think about events like Bill Gates having access to a computer at a young age, a seemingly insignificant event. That ultimately set him on the path to becoming one of the most influential figures in the world, or the 9/11 attacks, which had profound and far-reaching consequences that rippled through the economy and society for years to come. Or even the unlikely rise of companies like Apple and Amazon, which defied all expectations and transformed entire industries.
These are events that nobody could have predicted, yet they had a monumental impact on the world as we know it. It makes you realize just how much of our lives are shaped by chance and circumstance, things that are beyond our control.
And that's precisely why Housel emphasizes the importance of understanding tail events. It's not about trying to predict the unpredictable, but rather acknowledging that these events exist and having a plan in place to navigate them when they inevitably occur.
Building a financial foundation that is resilient and adaptable, able to withstand those unexpected shocks and setbacks. That life inevitably throws our way. How can we possibly plan for events that are by their very nature unpredictable?
Well, that's where the idea of having a margin of safety comes in. It's about having a buffer in your financial plan, a cushion to absorb those unforeseen expenses or market downturns. It's about not stretching yourself too thin so that when those unexpected events do happen, you're not completely caught off guard.
It's like having an emergency fund, but for your entire financial life.
Exactly. It's about having a plan that can withstand the unexpected and having the flexibility to adapt as circumstances change. But let's shift gears for a moment and explore one of Housel's most thought-provoking ideas, what he calls the seduction of pessimism.
This one really struck a chord with me. Let's face it, the world has objectively improved in countless ways over the past century. Yet pessimism often seems to dominate the headlines
Yeah.
and our conversations. Why is that?
It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? And Housel offers some really insightful explanations. First, he points out that our brains are wired for negativity bias. We're naturally drawn to focus on threats and dangers, a survival mechanism that was probably quite useful for our ancestors trying to avoid predators in the wild. But in today's world, this negativity bias can distort our perceptions and lead us to overestimate risks and underestimate opportunities.
Like our brains are stuck in this primitive survival mode, constantly scanning for threats, even when we're surrounded by abundance and progress.
Right. And then there's the role of the media.
Yeah.
Bad news sells. And we're constantly bombarded with stories of conflict, disaster, and economic turmoil. It creates this perception that the world is a dangerous and unpredictable place, even when the data suggests otherwise.
He uses some great examples from history, like the predictions of America's decline in the 1980s, which obviously didn't pan out, or the initial dismissal of the Wright brothers' invention, this revolutionary idea of flying machines that people just simply couldn't fathom at the time. It's fascinating how easily we can dismiss something that challenges our existing beliefs or fears. Even when presented with evidence to the contrary, are we just drawn to these dramatic narratives, even if they don't necessarily reflect reality?
It's a fascinating question, and it speaks to the power of storytelling and our inherent desire for compelling narratives, even if they're not always grounded in truth.
But the real danger here is that this constant barrage of negativity can cloud our judgment and prevent us from making sound financial decisions. If we're constantly bombarded with messages of fear and uncertainty, we might be less inclined to invest, to take risks, to pursue our dreams.
And that's why Housel stresses the importance of developing a financial philosophy that works for you, one that's grounded in a realistic assessment of risk and opportunity, and not swayed by the whims of the market or the latest doom and gloom headlines. It's about tuning out the noise and focusing on what you can control, your own actions and decisions.
He talks about the importance of humility, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that we're bound to make mistakes along the way.
And forgiveness, the ability to let go of past financial mistakes and learn from them without letting them define our future decisions.
And perhaps most importantly, he emphasizes the need to leave room for error in our plans, recognizing that life is unpredictable and that things won't always go according to plan.
And that's where the idea of diversification comes in. It's about not putting all your eggs in one basket, spreading your investments across different asset classes and industries to mitigate risk and protect yourself from those unforeseen events.
He also talks about the importance of finding joy in the process. It's not just about achieving a certain financial goal, but about enjoying the journey along the way.
It's about aligning your spending with your values, making choices that bring you happiness and fulfillment, rather than simply chasing after the next shiny object or trying to keep up with the Joneses.
And that ties into his idea of using money to gain control over your time. He argues that this is the ultimate dividend, the ability to do what you want when you want, without being beholden to a paycheck or a boss.
That's what financial independence is all about. It's not necessarily about retiring early or never working again, but about having the freedom to choose how you spend your time.
And remember, as Housel points out, that freedom comes with a cost. The cost of investing is volatility uncertainty and the occasional gut-wrenching downturn.
Yeah, he uses that great analogy of an amusement park. You pay the price of admission to experience the thrills and rewards. But sometimes it rains, and that doesn't mean you should abandon the park altogether.
It's about recognizing that risk is part of the equation, and it's a fee we pay for the potential of long-term gains. But how do we balance this desire for freedom and control with the inherent risks and uncertainties of the market?
Well, that's where Housel's advice about being reasonable, rather than strictly rational, comes in. It's about acknowledging that we're emotional beings, not spreadsheets. And our decisions are influenced by more than just cold, hard logic.
He uses the example of a doctor prescribing fever to fight an infection. It might be the rational course of action, but it's also incredibly uncomfortable for the patient. In finance, sometimes the rational choice might be to take on more leverage or stick to a rigid investment plan. But if it causes you too much stress or anxiety, you're less likely to stick with it. So it's really about finding a balance between what makes sense on paper and what feels right emotionally.
Exactly. He even encourages people to love their investments, which sounds kind of counterintuitive at first. But the idea is that if you have an emotional connection to your strategy, you're more likely to stay committed. During tough times,
it's like that old saying, it's not about timing the market, but time in the market. The longer you stay invested, the more likely you are to ride out the inevitable ups and downs and reap the rewards of long-term growth.
That's a great way to put it. And it speaks to the importance of patience and resilience in investing. But speaking of long-term growth, Housel reminds us that we're not just investing in the market, we're also investing in ourselves.
And that brings us to this really intriguing concept he calls the end of history illusion.
Right. It's this idea that we tend to think we've already become the people we'll be for the rest of our lives. We underestimate how much our values desires, and circumstances will change in the future.
Yeah, and that can really throw a wrench into your long-term financial plans.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. And that's why Housel stresses the importance of flexibility and adaptability in our financial plans. We need to be able to adjust our strategies as our circumstances change and not be afraid to revisit our goals and priorities as we go through different stages of life.
He even shares his own personal story about this, figuring out how to get the goalpost to stop moving. He and his wife made a conscious decision early on to establish a comfortable lifestyle and stick with it,
Yeah,
even as their income increased.
right.
It's almost like they found that sweet spot where they could enjoy the present while still planning for the future, without feeling deprived or constantly chasing after the next level of material possessions.
It's a great example of how you can achieve financial security without sacrificing your quality of life or getting caught up in that never-ending cycle of wanting more. And it ties into another important point Housel makes about the dangers of comparing ourselves to others, what he calls keeping up with the Joneses.
Oh, that's a classic trap. That constant pressure to match the spending habits of our peers or those we see on social media. But as Housel points out, it's a recipe for financial stress and potential regret. We're often comparing our insides to other people's outsides, not seeing the full picture of their financial situation or the sacrifices they might be making to maintain that image of success.
Right? It's like comparing apples and oranges. We don't see their struggles, their anxieties, or the debt they might be carrying. It's a reminder that true wealth isn't about what you display on the outside, but about the security, freedom, and peace of mind you cultivate on the inside.
And that kind of circles back to Housel's idea of using money to gain control over your time. It's not just about having a big bank account. It's about having the flexibility to choose how you spend your days, whether that's pursuing a passion, spending time with loved ones, or simply having the freedom to say no to things you don't want to do.
He argues that freedom to choose how you spend your time, that's the ultimate dividend of financial independence. It's not about retiring early or living a life of luxury. It's about aligning your time with your values and priorities.
And that's something I think many of us can relate to, that desire to have more control over our time and our lives. But as Housel reminds us that freedom isn't free. It comes with a cost.
The cost of investing, he says, is volatility, uncertainty, and the occasional gut-wrenching downturn. He compares it to the price of admission to an amusement park. You pay to experience the thrills and the rewards, but sometimes it rains. And that doesn't mean you should abandon the park altogether.
Right. It's a great analogy. It highlights the reality that risk is an inherent part of investing, a price we pay for the potential of long-term growth and financial freedom. And it brings us back to that idea we discussed earlier about building a financial philosophy that works for you.
Right. It's about understanding your own risk tolerance, your goals and your values, and making choices that align with those priorities. It's not about finding the one right answer or blindly following someone else's advice. It's about creating a financial plan that is tailored to your unique circumstances and aspirations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the psychology of money, what would you say are some of the most important takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think Housel's book offers a powerful reminder that financial success isn't just about mastering the numbers, but about understanding the psychology behind our financial decisions. It's about recognizing our biases, developing healthy financial habits, and building a mindset that is geared towards long-term growth and fulfillment.
It's about taking a holistic approach to money, one that considers not just our financial goals, but also our values, our priorities, and our overall well-being.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs along the way. But by focusing on what we can control, making informed choices, and staying true to our values, we can create a financial future that is both secure and personally rewarding.
That's such a great point to end on. So to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and some practical tools to apply to your own financial journey.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did any particular stories or concepts from the book resonate with you? What will you do differently or think about differently when it comes to your own finances? Let us know. We're always here to help you navigate. the fascinating and sometimes perplexing world of money. Until next time, happy investing, and remember, stay curious.